So thanks for inviting you again. I'm Wade Merritt. I'm the Vice President of the Maine International Trade Center. I think I'm also the longest serving member of the Citizens Trade Policy Commission somehow, after 9 years, which is kind of crazy. And a lot of you know me. If you don't, I'm a resident of South Portland, but I grew up in Bangor and spent most of my time at the Trade Center, actually dating back to 1996 as the director of our Bangor office. The Trade Center is a public-private partnership. We were formed back in the mid-90s. We were formed by a unanimous act of the state legislature. This is something that I had left out for quite a while, but would like to remind the legislators that, yes, in fact, you were able to do something unanimously at some point, and it was forming our organization. We really appreciate that. We are a public-private partnership. We report into the Labor and Commerce Committee. My boss, Janine Carey, who typically would be giving this presentation, is a state employee. She reports to the Department of Economic and Community Development. I am not, and everybody else who's below me in the organization are employees of the nonprofit. So thanks to the legislators for your ongoing support of us. Our primary partner is the federal U.S. Department of Commerce, who helps us with some of those dispute resolution issues, but also works with us on setting up business appointments for companies that are traveling abroad. What we're probably best known for are our overseas activities. We do probably 3 to 4 trade shows abroad each year. We just took 4 companies, small Maine producers, food producers, to the Fancy Food West show in San Francisco back in January. We have a delegation at the European Seafood Exposition in Brussels right now. And as I mentioned, we're public-private. Most of the private side of that is a membership organization, a membership base of anywhere between 250 and 300 companies. Obviously, it fluctuates quite a bit from year to year. 80% of the companies that we work with and that our members have under 100 employees. So at the bottom here you see our collaborators. They're pretty much most of the economic development agencies in the state, both state and federal, and not listed here local, but we've done quite a bit at the local level as well. 297 member companies and organizations and members in every county in the state. We're currently receiving about $498,000 in the current budget proposal. This is about an $80,000 cut in our allocation since 2007. We're actually receiving less state dollars than we had since the late 90s. $3.2 billion is the amount of exports that the state did in 2012. This was slightly off from 2011. And finally, 24,000 workers. This is kind of an old number from probably 5 years ago or so. But I still think it's fairly close to accurate. 24,000 Maine workers are currently employed by foreign companies. Those two numbers shouldn't be added together because a number of the international companies, of course, are exporting. But it again gives you an idea of how important international is to the state's economy and the state's workforce. It would be like a U.S. subsidiary. It would be a Maine-based subsidiary of a foreign company. Sure.
And you have a list of those that you could share with us?
I sure do.
Okay, that would be great.
Yeah, we'd be happy to do that. So obviously this is a major component of the state's economy, and it's growing in importance. I'll show you a slide here in a minute that this matches up with what we're seeing at the national level, where fully half the economic growth in the United States from 2011 and again in 2012 came from international markets and not from the domestic economy. In 2000, Maine exports accounted for about 5.5% of the gross state product and is closer to 7% now. As I mentioned before, increase of 24% over the past 5 years and 74% over the past 10. So this is why we pay very close attention to what's going on, both at this commission and in other forums, because the growth is clearly coming from outside markets. And what we do as far as free trade agreements and in the way in which we are negotiating with foreign markets can have a direct impact on what's going on in our state and with our workforce. Where are we exporting? This is kind of these are our top 10 export markets over the past 12 years or so. No, how long is that? Anyway, the last few years. 1996, of course, being the benchmark year for when we opened the doors, and then at midpoint, and then in the last year. Should not be any surprise that Canada is number 1, and it's number 1 by a long way. The question always is raised, why Malaysia? Malaysia is and has been for a very long time our number 2 export market, but it has generally, or not generally, it is 99.5% semiconductors. So when I give you a little bit more of an analysis on that in a minute, you'll see I left that out for that reason. It's not giving a particularly accurate picture of what's really going on here.
But if
Yeah, I'm
I
sorry.
could just
Yeah.
interject, I think one thing that's interesting just looking at that is when we think about the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is being negotiated right now, included within that are Malaysia, Singapore, I don't know if any of the other ones, but and Canada, certainly.
Japan.
And Japan is not yet fully in it, but probably will be in 90 days. So you can see that there's actually implications from that, what happens in that agreement in terms of actual trading partners that we have right now.
By far the biggest change has been China's rapid ascension. In 1996, it was our 20th leading trade partner. I should say export partner. This does not account for imports. In 2012, we exported $1.3 billion to Canada. We heard that from Mr. DeVoe. $467 million to Malaysia, and $247 million to China. Intriguing markets for us moving forward. Turkey, which was 27th in 96, is now 7th after quite a rapid ascension. Much of that growth is in pulp and paper, but I think there's lots of good opportunities for other things. China and Canada, which although are very large and the percentage growth may not sound particularly impressive, remain excellent across the board markets for most of our products and services. Although, and I'll mention this later, we may be leaning a bit heavily in that direction. Some market diversification probably is in order. And the UAE, which is not on this list, but probably will be at some point.
UAE for everybody.
What's that? Oh, sorry, United Arab Emirates, or Dubai, colloquially, which is not on this list, but probably will be at some point. This has been largely driven by defense industries, defense-related items, but we've also had some good success there with our food products. Currently, Maine exports 22 million to the UAE, which makes it 18th, but it's had a 570% growth rate since 2005 and 2,000% since 1996, and it's not really showing any signs of letting up.
Piece that's missing is how much we import from Canada, and just for the fun of it, and then whether if those imports we would have the ability to meet some of those imports with our own manufacturing.
All of the fisheries-related organizations, it seems to me, are significant by their absence.
Yeah, I would say this is definitely not a complete list, and in fact, we do work closely with those guys, DMR and Maine Lobster Promotion, Maine Lobster Association.
Energy, is there any cross-border, I'm thinking mostly Canada, US, energy export?
It's and actually this will be a nice segue to Senator Sherman's questions as well. We don't track it. The U.S. does not track that, and so what this is based on is what the numbers I'm showing you are based on is the transit of a shippable product, something that you put in a box and you send over the border. So we're not boxing up electrons and sending them over. Now, to Senator Sherman's question about import numbers, and this will hopefully kind of answer yours as well. I've yet to see any import numbers at the state level that give me any confidence that there's any accuracy to them at all. The exception to that, however, is the Canadian import data, and I think I've shared that with you before, but I'm happy to do it again. We haven't looked at that much recently. Because what it is, it's the Canadian export data that we're looking at. To use the numbers from earlier today, we do $3 billion worth of trade from between Maine and Canada. It's about 2/3 Canadian exports to Maine, and it's about 1/3 going the other direction. But of that $3 billion, $1 billion of it was oil coming in from Irving. So immediately, that's important. Obviously, we want to talk about that, but it's not really showing necessarily the trade balance. Our traditional sectors we've been working in, we talked about the seafood industry. This is number 3. Our primary markets are Canada, where a lot of it is going back and forth for processing and reprocessing. Japan, Hong Kong, China, these are all major growth areas for the lobster and some shrimp, mainly lobster. This is a 79% growth over the last, I think these are 5-year growth numbers. Agricultural products, vegetables, fruits and berries. Again, you're seeing where most of this is going. Textiles was a kind of a big surprise because everybody knows that the textile industry is dead in the state, but that we did about $25 million worth of exports there. that's a couple of companies mainly that are doing carpets, but there are a few that are doing other kind of more advanced fabrics, say for the aerospace industry or fire retardants or
Right.
some of the other ones.
Tex Tech or
Tex-Tech would be in that.
in Monmouth?
Yeah, Tex-Tech would be in there. Auburn Manufacturing, there's a few others that would be in there. Ships, boats, and floating structures, this is the yacht industry. They're starting to see some international growth again after the plummet in 2009 when the bottom fell out of the world economy, especially the trade economy. Canada continues to be number one for that. We're seeing a lot of opportunities in Northwest Europe. One market that they're trying to break into is in Asia. There's the beginning, hopefully, of a yachting culture in China. We've also been looking at Japan and in Korea. Some of these have very unique situations. Korea, for example, applies a 500% luxury tax on yachts. So although you would think that the Korean peninsula would be a wonderful place for boating, and it is, it's very, very expensive to get a foreign or even a domestically built yacht into the Korean market. So many of them are importing them as fishing boats, which is an interesting way to get around the tax. And many of them are buying them and then parking them in places like Taiwan and the Philippines and flying down there and doing their yachting from there. So Asia, I think, is a good potential, but it's going to require a lot more development.
The amount of trees going into Canada is 10 times, coming from Canada is 10 times the amount going into Canada, going into New Brunswick. And it comes back here as value added. I think the International Trade Center should do some type of study on the tremendous inequity that leaves Maine at a disadvantage when it comes to the softwood lumber.
Our three emerging sectors that I mentioned in the open here, aircraft and aircraft parts. We have a number of suppliers within that chain. This has been growing substantially over the past 10 years. A lot of high-tech machine shops that are getting involved in that area of business and are finding good success overseas. Industrial machinery and pharmaceutical products, still fairly small on the export side, but are definitely areas that we're interested in working with more fully. The Biotech Association of Maine and several of the other associations are very active and have been working very closely with us over the years to help develop those international markets. Last year, which is not on here, 2011, I just did it every other year, but last year, 2011, was a state record with about $3.5 billion. We slipped slightly, but that was almost entirely accounted for by the semiconductors industry. I'm just going to give you the three that these companies identified as the areas of highest need. The first one was transportation costs, which was identified by fully 80% of the companies that were surveyed. This was the highest regardless of geography. And what we found really interesting was that the companies that were identifying this as a problem were generally companies that were established exporters, had a high percentage of sales overseas, and surprisingly, those located along the I-95 and 295 corridor were the ones that identified the transportation issues as most restrictive. So what are we doing? We're working with the Maine DOT on their upcoming transportation study. Janine Carey, who's my boss, sits on the Maine Port Authority Board of Directors, so we're quite involved in discussions around what's going on about improving freight access in and out of the state, internationally and domestically. IMSCIP, of course, with their new container service, which has started already in Portland. And then finally, the Action Committee of 50, working with them closely on their Searsport to Bangor Transportation Corridor Initiative. Foreign market barriers, which is going to sound familiar to a lot of you from the other direction, because this is something that the Commission has spent a lot of time talking about, mainly in the other direction, however, on the potential effects of free trade agreements on what our foreign partners would perceive as barriers, but we talk about as regulations.